And I'm going to introduce your next speaker to you. I'm going to introduce Dr. Ali Watson. Ali is a professor in the School of International Relations here at the University of St Andrews. Her research interests lie in examining grassroots perspectives and marginalised actors within the international system, and in particular in considering how their incorporation into the higher discourse may change the questions raised within the discipline itself, as well as in its subfields. This, of course, has included a body of work on the place of children and youth in the international system and an ongoing examination into questions of rights and agency, currently working on issues of Indigenous rights within North America and East Africa. So if I could please introduce Dr. Ali Watson. Cheers.
Good morning, it's nice to be here. I'm from Aberdeenshire, so I'm shaved this morning. It's also nice.
I'll just go now.
It's also nice to be somewhere. I must say, I don't usually speak Edinburgh now with people with noticeable Scottish accents, and so my students that are in the room might notice that my accent after hearing Gavin is a bit stronger than it usually is. Okay, I was asked to speak today about the underrepresented state of the world's children in issues of conflict, and I will. But I want to talk about something else as well. I want to talk about the ways that we sometimes forget that it's people that are at the heart of peace. But when we look at international relations, we spend a lot of time talking about organisations, and if you have to give a definition of what is international relations, people say, well, relations between states and international organisations, etc. We forget that at the heart of peace, at the heart of conflict, are people. And today what I'd like to talk a little bit about as well is the ways in which looking at peace and conflict through a sort of child-focused lens can perhaps help us to remember. Of course, this is a day when you'll hear lots about the power of play, so it might seem to be odd to be talking about children that are living in circumstances where play might seem to be impossible. In the majority of current conflicts across the globe, the victims are overwhelmingly civilian, and children make up a large number of those civilians. Most obviously, when children are hurt, it's because maybe they've been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sometimes they're deliberately targeted, either because they might represent the sort of future of a particular community, whether it's a community based on sort of ethnic, racial, religious identities, or because children sometimes are soldiers themselves, and so attacking them is seen as justifiable. Children are forced to fight, sometimes they make that choice themselves. They also might do other things. They might demonstrate, they might throw stones, they might help to carry supplies or carry messages. Children take part in conflict. They're affected as well by living in an area that's in conflict, particularly if that conflict is one that's been ongoing for many years. There's a psychological impact of that, an impact on education, an economic impact. They may lose access to healthcare, they may lose family and friends, they may lose their homes, they'd be forced perhaps to leave their communities. Many, many millions of children are internally displaced, they're refugees, they might find themselves parenting younger siblings. Despite the fact that they're directly impacted by war, children are often seen as a footnote. And I think that's when I was asked to talk about this underrepresentation, given that we're talking about play today, and the power of play, that fact that they're so much impacted that they're being seen as a sort of footnote when talking about peace is something that's really sort of quite noticeable. Policymakers, of course, talk about it a lot. Don't get me wrong, the sort of rhetoric surrounding peace often has children at its focus. And you can see the sort of signing ceremonies of peace agreements, etc. There's always a sort of talk about the children of the future. I've got quotes offering the children the future they deserve, which is now coming within their grasp. Young people we support the development of special community-based initiatives based on international best practice, etc. Giving children the chance to have the future we all want for our children, our children's children. An important moment to give a secure and peaceful future for our children. What you see is they're mentioned a lot in the rhetoric for peace, but despite those statements, in the actual text of peace agreements, you don't see children there. They're not mentioned, and they're not particularly sort of talked about. Now, you might sort of say, well, what could be said anyway? The peace agreements are about something else. They're about states, they're about international organisations, they're about ceasefires and legalities and getting, all the sort of nuts and bolts sort of sorted out. And once all of those sort of structures for administering peace come into operation, then we can begin to think about children. We can't have a whole load of kids at the conference table. Where would we put them? What could they do? What would somebody offering a perspective on children sort of give us? There are bigger things to sort out. Territorial claims, land rights, etc. And that's true, there are those things to sort out. But by constantly having those very sort of top-down approaches, what isn't considered is even the expertise of those who might be able to advocate for children. We don't think of them in the same way. It's a sort of trickle down. But if you're actually going to address the root causes of conflict, you need to talk to societies. You need to think about who are in societies, and children and youth are in those societies. They might even be able to have an active role in creating peace, in sort of ensuring the sustainability of peace. So, for example, if we look at the case of Colombia, the children's peace and the children's peace movement in Colombia. By the mid-1990s, there was a series of peace negotiations that began, spearheaded by a conciliation commission that was made up of sort of prominent civic leaders, religious leaders, and as a civil society effort, it was actually sort of quite successful, much more successful than anything actually that the government had managed to achieve. But as a whole, it remained pretty weak and pretty sort of fragmented until the creation of a children's movement for peace. And beginning with a number of young people working in isolation, numbers, sort of under 10 it began with, without a formal structure, that escalated into this particular social force that contributed to the peace process and was recognised in nomination for a Nobel Peace Prize. So children can do things like that. They can also, of course, undermine peace as well. Peace agreements are represent one of the beginning of where a society that's trying to heal after conflict goes. But when you think about it, they face those who've been involved in conflict, those who've been soldiers themselves, face the impact they have to integrate. But whereas there's often sort of a lot done for adults, there's often less done for children. And so people recognise that children have this place. So what could we do instead? We could argue for more representation of the interests of children when concluding peaceful settlement. We could do that. We then have to begin to think, what is a child? Because that isn't an agreement. That isn't particularly an agreement either. If we think that a child is everyone under the age of 18, that 18 is a very Western construct. 18 is when you finish secondary education in the West. It's not, if you're a 16-year-old and you're in charge of your family already, you need the rights there. But it's not sort of, I'm not saying they shouldn't have protection, but that notion of under 18 is sort of difficult. And there's a lot of sort of talk about it. There are children who've been heads of households from the age of 12 who might have had to leave homes and try and find safety, who might have to labour because they need an income, who might then have made that decision to become child soldiers, or in the West, a very sometimes similar decision to sort of join a gang. But their specific interests are not represented at the international level. And so what am I sort of arguing for? And I guess what I said at the start was that it's important for us to remember that peace is about people, and healing is about people. Yes, it's about agreements, and yes, it's about legalities, and yes, it's about marginalisation, and getting over that and everything else. Politics is at once highly complex, but it's also very simple. So, for example, in my classes, there's one class in particular that we basically play at being politicians. Every year we do a simulation. We play at being politicians. And everyone gets sort of divided into groups. And last year we did one, and it was, we were looking at the year, and so we had some people were tribal representatives, we had government representatives, we had NGO representatives, international NGO representatives, we had youth representatives, we had women's organisation representatives, all amongst the students. And we had somebody who came in from a UN organisation to run this simulation. And at the end of the simulation, certain things had happened. There has been certain coalitions formed between the groups. There were certain things, the youth were finding it very difficult for anybody to listen to them. The women and the youth sort of banded together, but even both together they were finding that very difficult. And so we were playing at being politicians. And what was the most interesting thing for me at the end was that when we talked to this UN representative who had sat in very similar negotiations, he said that's exactly what happens. These, this is what happens. These are the sort of coalitions that are formed. These are the types of interaction that take place. Because what we forget is if we see a peace negotiation and it has 20 people, and we see a peace negotiation and it has 3 people, it's more likely that the negotiation with 3 people is going to work because there's only 3 people. It's the same with you. If 3 of you think we're going to have dinner tonight, that's much that you can decide that. If 20 of you decide, you can't decide at all. And so really sort of politics, we have to sort of look as well and sort of see how simple sometimes that they can be. So. Okay, so at the heart then for me of that sort of concentration upon children and their needs is really sort of call to recognise that in order to really create a sustainable peace in a post-conflict society, what is needed is recognition that it's people that's the heart of the peace and people that's the heart of the conflict. It might seem obvious, it might seem simple, and policymakers like elaborate rhetoric, they like public signing ceremonies, they like to demonstrate they're the ones that brokered the peace during their time in office. They like to say that they made the first step. They like to do public apologies. But really that only rings true if there's follow through. And think about it again as well on an interpersonal basis. If Gavin and I had a long running disagreement, okay, what happens then if we want to try, we've got to the point we just can't take this anymore, it's affecting everybody around us, what are we going to do? Okay, so we need to apologise. So I say sorry to Gavin, right? Sorry about that. And Gavin said, well, that's not enough. Why did you do it in the first place?
Have I done something?
What did you do in the first place? Why did you do this? Do you recognise how much that you've done? Gavin, you want to know that. So me just saying sorry, Gavin, isn't really going to cut it. It's also not going to cut it if I say sorry, Gavin, I keep on doing exactly the same things as I was doing anyway. That's very, very similar if you have an apology, for example, as part of a peace agreement. That apology has to mean something, and it has to sort of mean something on the ground. So I suppose to sort of begin to sort of sum up, I like to read recipe books. I don't not cook particularly, I just like to read recipe books. And there's a chef called Marcus Sanderson who has a nice quote in his biography, and he says, restaurant kitchens will always be an element of playground justice to them. Big guys will pick on little guys, and new kids will be teased for whatever makes them stick out from the rest. If there's a weak spot, somebody will find it. I would argue that international relations really is much different. So although the talk today isn't really about the power of play, what it is about is recognising that peace begins small. and it means individuals healing from what they suffered, and it means that yes, peace and conflict takes place in boardrooms and it takes place on battlefields, but it also takes place in homes and in schools and in communities and in neighbourhoods and across doorsteps. And really, that's the only way to look at it, to sort of think, for me anyway, that adults and children can only feel that they can begin to heal if those actual agreements that you've got actually mean something in terms of the everyday lives that they lead.